I'd like to tell you a story this morning, a story that is quite incredible. In fact, I think that as I share this story, some of you will say to yourself, surely that story can't be true. Well, it is true, every single word of it. After the service, Google it. Story is of a man, one man, who a bit over 70, 80 years ago wrote one word. And that one word was read by over 2 billion people. An Australian man, a man that had a very ordinary upbringing. Arthur Stace was born into poverty there in inner city Sydney in the suburb of Redfern. Arthur Stace never went to school, never learned to read or write. So the fact that his work was read by over 2 billion people is extraordinary in itself. Arthur Stace found himself in prison at the age of 15 for stealing. Arthur Stace went to war, World War I, came back and continued the drinking that he had started when he was a teenager. Arthur Stace was an alcoholic. So on that Wednesday morning in 1930, when Arthur Stace woke in the gutter, as he had been doing for the previous 10 years, addicted to methylated spirits. What a terrible drink that is. Any drink is terrible. Methylated spirits, to be drinking that every single day. Arthur Stace, when he woke that Wednesday morning, didn't know that by that evening everything would be completely different. When Arthur Stace woke that Wednesday morning back there in 1930 in the streets of Sydney, as he had woken most mornings, he was hungover and hungry. And later on that evening, he went to a church. St. Barnabas is there in Broadway, for anybody who remembers the old Grace Brothers store back then. Arthur Stace went to St. Barnabas not so much to experience anything supernatural, but to get some supper. See, St. Barnabas back then was offering a small meal and a cup of tea for homeless people. But the catch was back there in 1930, if you went to St. Barnabas's for some cake and a cup of tea, the catch was that you had to listen to the minister's sermon. So in St. Barnabas's there, nearly 100 years ago, 100 homeless men sat and listened to the Reverend's sermon. This was the first time that Arthur Stace had ever been in a church. And during the sermon, something supernatural happened. Arthur Stace heard about a loving God. Arthur Stace heard about a loving God that loved each of us so much that he became one of us. Arthur Stace heard the incredible good news, the gospel of Jesus Christ. And Arthur Stace felt a warming in his heart. And Arthur Stace that night became a follower of Jesus and never drank again. Arthur Stace would joke afterwards for many years that evening he came for a rock cake and left with the rock of ages in his heart. Arthur Stace began, as God's Spirit cleaned up his life, began volunteering in various homeless shelters around Sydney. And every weekend and a couple of times during the week he would attend religious services and hear the good news of Jesus Christ. He couldn't read it, but he could hear it. 2 years later, in a church in Paddington where he was volunteering, the minister got up and began speaking about eternity. And the text that the minister read out there in 1932, the text that he read out in Isaiah 57 and verse 15 was this. For thus says, and I'm reading from the King James because back there in 1932, that's what he would have read out. For thus says the high and lofty one, he that lives for eternity. His name is holy, and he says, yes, I dwell in the high and holy place, but I lower myself to live with he that is humble and lowly and contrite of spirit. And as Arthur heard that sermon, this idea of a loving creator that would lower himself to live with each one of us, Arthur's heart was stirred once again. The minister there in this church in Paddington in 1932 finished with this appeal. Eternity, eternity. Oh, I wish I could shout it to the streets of Sydney. Eternity, eternity. Where will you spend eternity? At the end of the service, Arthur walked out of the church. There was something happening in his heart. Arthur Stace says that he reached into his coat pocket and in there he found a piece of chalk. He doesn't know where it came from or why it was there. But on that street directly outside the church there in 1932, he bent down and with that chalk wrote out a single word. That word, eternity. Arthur Stace says he didn't know how that word was spelled. It just came out there as he bent down to write it. Came out perfectly. And Arthur Stace went home. The following morning, Arthur Stace said that he was woken at about 4 o'clock that morning, before dawn. He was compelled to get up, get dressed, walk out into the pre-dawn streets there. And once again, outside his door, he bent down and wrote a single word, eternity. And then Harry, Arthur Stace, this former drunk, sober for 2 years, walked 100 metres up the dark road and once again bent down and wrote the word eternity. That morning, before the sun had even rose, Arthur Stace had written the word eternity 100 times in the area around his streets. And then Arthur Stace that morning went off to work. The next morning, at 4 o'clock in the morning, before dawn, he was woken again. And what do you think he did? He got up, he got dressed, he went downstairs, and with some chalk, he went the other direction, writing out the word eternity 100 times before the sun rose. He did it for the entire week and the next, and in fact, the whole month. And as people around his area walked to work that day, as they'd done for the previous month, they saw in various parts this perfect copperplate script of one word written in chalk, the word eternity, and wondered who might be doing it. Arthur Stace began catching a train and a bus, going to other suburbs, month after month, writing out the word eternity 50 to 60 times before he would go home and have breakfast and head off to work that day. Arthur Stace did it for a year, 2 years, occasionally there would be a newspaper article. And they're in Sydney back in the 1930s. Who's writing out the word eternity on our streets in chalk? No one knew. 2 years turned into 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, 10 years, 50 times a day. Arthur Stace would write out the word eternity. He would catch trains as far west as Parramatta, as far north on ferries to Manly, as far south down to Cogra. And Arthur Stace, for 30 years, wrote the word eternity. My grandmother and grandfather told me this story back when I was a little kid of the man that wrote the word eternity. No one knew at the time who was doing it. My mother tells me that she was walking hand in hand with her mother, my grandmother, one day, and there in their suburb they saw at 100-metre intervals the word eternity. And my young mother, well, she's not so young now, but she was young back then, turned to her mother and said, "What does it mean?" And her mother said, "I don't know, but let's find out." Arthur Stace wrote this word out for 37 years, every day. Now you do the maths. 50 times 7 times 52 times 37. Over 500,000 times Arthur Stace wrote out the word eternity. And the whole city in the 1930s and 40s and 50s and even the early 60s wondered, who was it? Who was this person writing a single word on the streets of Sydney to draw attention to this idea that one day we will be faced with where we spend eternity? In the mid-1960s, with only a couple of years of Arthur left still to live, his minister saw him one morning writing out the word eternity and discovered that it was Arthur, the former drunk that attended his church and faithfully helped out for decades, looking after the homeless people around the area. And his minister said, "Arthur, we need to tell people it's you." And of course, Arthur, being the humble and contrite person, low of spirit, said, "No, we don't need to do that, Pastor." But the minister called the newspaper. And there in 1965, with only 18 months left for Arthur to live, the newspaper came down one morning and caught a photograph of Arthur writing out the words. In fact, the photographer for the newspaper at the time only had enough film, remember what that was, for 4 photographs. He took 4 photographs of Arthur writing out the word. He said, "Stay here, let me just quickly run back to the office and get some more film." And the photographer says by the time he came back, 10 minutes or more, Arthur was gone. Arthur died in 1967, only a few weeks before South Sydney would beat Canterbury in the Rugby League Grand Final and end St George Dragons' 11 years of dominance. That's another story. And the story of Arthur Stace was slowly forgotten. Old people would tell their grandchildren in the decades to come of this strange man who wrote the word eternity. A man who never went to school. a man who was in prison by the age of 15, a man who was a drunk on the streets of Sydney for over a decade, writing one word perfectly on the streets of Sydney for almost 4 decades. And as Sydney began to forget the story, in the 1990s, the people planning New Year's Eve for the millennium, for the year 2000, were looking for a symbol. Were looking for something to put on the Sydney Harbour Bridge. You know, at New Year's Eve, when they have all the fireworks and the crescendo of that celebration is something that lights up on the Sydney Harbour Bridge. You've seen that on telly or been there in person. Well, someone in that meeting said, look, we have the millennium kicking in. Who knows what's going to happen? We think that planes are going to fall out of the sky. Remember that? We think that all the computers are going to crash. We need something that's emblematic of this new age. And someone suggested, I remember a story my grandfather told me. Why don't we put up that word that ordinary former drunk wrote on the streets of Sydney for 37 years. And so as 1999 kicked over to 2000 there with the fireworks of Sydney, and with Sydney being one of the first cities in the world that celebrates any new year, 1 billion people were watching. And there at the crescendo, as Sydney Harbour Bridge exploded, and if you squint there a little bit, you'll see Arthur Stace's word being watched by 1 billion people. An ordinary man with one word being led by God to do extraordinary things. But there's 1 billion people watching. What did I say before at the beginning of the sermon, Adam? Ben, sorry? 2 billion. And you're thinking, there you go again, he's got his facts wrong, exaggerating again, isn't he? That word in the year 2000 had such an extraordinary impact at the time that the organisers, James, of the Sydney Olympics said, let's use it for the closing ceremony. And with another 1 billion people, different from a few months earlier, watching this time, Arthur Stace's word, reflecting on the glory of God, was shown again. 2 billion people. Here's my point. God can do extraordinary things with an ordinary person willing to follow him. As you sit here and listen to the story of Arthur Stace, I wonder if that same spirit that blessed him is blessing you right now. An extraordinary God doing extraordinary things as he has for millennia with ordinary people. Why not you? Eternity. Where will you spend eternity?